for me, if we're going to talk about cybersecurity, it's always important to talk about how much we love the internet. And with Valentine's Day on Tuesday, I think it's important to take stock of why this is such a big problem. And that's because the World Wide Web is so important to all of us, right? It's how we deliver great healthcare services. It's how children communicate to their Barbies. It's how we pass national security secrets around the world. And that's really kind of what's at core here is that, over the last 20, 25 years, we found a great platform to change our lives in so many positive ways, and it's sort of under attack. Oh, right, that doesn't work. Right? Okay, there we go. So what I want to start with is this idea of preemption. At the beginning of the day, Ted talked about how the business of being an attacker is just too good, right? We see every day attackers send emails to companies and say, if you don't pay us 5 Bitcoins, we're going to DDoS your company. And whether or not that threat is real or not, companies often pay that. Now, 5 Bitcoins, today is I think about $5,000, is that right? It's about $1,000 per Bitcoin. That's a pretty good day for a guy to just send out 100 emails to 100 random people and get someone to pay him a lot of money, even in the United States, but also particularly around the world where that matters. So, the idea of preemption is to take an action before something bad happens. In security, we seem to do the opposite, right? We seem to be reacting constantly, but not doing things proactively or preemptively. But in almost every other phenomenon in our lives, we take preemptive actions. Jim talked about how they're trying to send emails to customers or potential customers so that they take proactive or preemptive measures to strengthen an individual's health. Because we know that in healthcare, actions that you take at Adam's age or my age mean that we pay less for your care in the future, right? And so that it saves us money. When you know that there's a potential for rain, sometimes you bring an umbrella, right? And it's sort of an easy thing. When you get into a car, you put a seatbelt on, right? When there's flu season, you don't walk around and you say to people, you don't walk around and wait for someone to cough on you to do something. People take the flu vaccine, and they take an action in front of it. And so in cybersecurity, what's puzzling is how we haven't kind of taken on this thing. And so it's not a new idea. We use this idea of preemption all the time, and I think it makes a lot of sense for us to kind of move into that space here. Now, as someone who worked at the NSA, the idea of offense is very grating to my spidey sense for all of the kind of legal things and conversations that Pat Dowd and Matt Olson and others have kind of had. But I think preemption is not offense, right? It's doing something that we know is threatening in advance. Every day at Area 1, we identify hundreds of thousands of new phishing websites that are created. Sites that are designed to look like Google, to look like Dropbox, that trick your users. The exact same types of sites that people like John Podesta and people throughout the election and people all around the world fall for, but companies fail to act on them before they impact their users. Oh, again, that doesn't work. Okay, who knows what's common about all of these things? Well, you don't count. Adam.
All these things start with phishing.
Well, it's even better. It's even better now, Adam. They are all phishing, right? These are all words for the same thing. And as we talked about at the start, one of the challenges in this space for people trying to find a solution has been nuance, right? At the Moscone Center all week, there will be a lot of words and a lot of hyperbole about the same thing over and over, and that's particularly true in this space. Phishing is the #1 cause of cybersecurity incidents, bar none. Out of the 227 incidents that Mandiant responded to in the prior year, 220 of them started with phishing. The other 7, they didn't know what the root cause of them was. So I would go even further than that. But what we see is that it's not about ransomware, right? 99% of ransomware is delivered via phishing. It's not about spear phishing or whaling. Phishing is a simple concept. It is anything that tries to elicit a user, either through clicking on a file or a link, or increasingly with fileless and linkless messages to take some sort of action, right? Enter their password, transfer money through a fraudulent wire, or send W-2s out, which has been really popular in this season. And so that's kind of the root cause. In the healthcare space, you wouldn't create a lot of drugs to deal with rashes, right? You kind of deal with the viruses that are infecting people. And it's important in this space when we think about preemption to focus on what is the root cause, right? And that's increasingly and always phishing. But what people understand, what people fail to understand about phishing, it's also not email, right? Phishing is email, it's web, and it's also a network-based attack. It comes from all directions at the organization. And what we see in solutions today is that they're siloed. There are email solutions, there are web solutions, there are awareness solutions, and then they're separate. But none of them have the ability to cut across. And they all fail users, and they all fail corporations at the end. And it keeps getting through, right? So here are just some examples, right? So this is the email that was used to hack John Podesta. It's a very benign looking message. You click, it pretends to be a password reset, looks very official from Google. It's not particularly sophisticated. That's not the word that I would use, although that's often the word that is used when describing these attacks. It's sort of generic on some level. And got someone to put their username and password in, and then has massive consequences. This is a common thing that's happening now in tax season, or tons of organizations, companies like Seagate Technologies last year, small schools, restaurants, right, are just being sent emails that spoof CEOs, and those go out. Now, there are a number of standards that attempt to authenticate senders, right? And these are DMARC, DKIM, SPF standards. But one of the challenges that we see with this is that it's very easy today to register a new Google email address, and those messages that come out can easily spoof the user's name, but also perform perfectly legitimately, right? And so you need technology to step in instead of the users and not focus so much on those fraud types of attacks. The alternatives, right, many of the things in this space have really been designed as anti-spam technologies. And spam and phishing are two very different problems. For instance, spam really captures 98%, and it has been commoditized over the last years. Who here uses a Google account? Okay. And who here really has ever seen spam in the last year? You get spam? You must go to a lot of weird sites. We should talk afterwards. But this is a thing for folks who have been in the enterprise for a long time, folks who have bought things like Ironport or Proofpoint in the past. That is a real problem to keep hygiene in the inbox secure. And what spam providers, anti-spam providers will tell you is that we've solved 98% of the problem, and there's still a 2% problem. But it turns out that 2% represents 100% of the damage, right? And that's where we wanted to focus. And then people over the last couple years have tried to stop this problem through education, teaching users. But I like to say that it's just as good as sex ed or driver school, both of which I've gone to and really have suffered the consequences of not paying attention very effectively, right? On that front. Okay, so what's behind the phishing, right? How can we really preempt it? Well, the first thing is it takes time to execute any sort of cyber campaign, right? And this is what we learned in our experience doing these attacks at NSA. It's what Pat and Colby were talking about in the last, is that it takes a lot of time to do this. Attackers, today we know the statistic that people learn about breaches about a year after they've started. But what most people don't know is that it takes about another year in front of that to execute and launch and build the infrastructure to launch the campaign. And so while attackers also want to be motivated and competitive, like they said, they also need a factory to launch their attacks from, right? They need an infrastructure, they need a base, they need a set of tools, and that's a time thing, right? And good cybersecurity should really be about turning timetables against the attackers. And so what we see is that there's this huge opportunity kind of in front of it. Attackers use proxy infrastructures, right? Nobody picks up their laptop and just starts whacking targets around the world. They'll find a machine somewhere, sometimes in doctors' offices, sometimes in schools, sometimes in small hosting providers, and they use that proxy infrastructure to launch their attacks. And they do that en masse, right? Not the Etsy, not the one-off attacks, but often hundreds or thousands of attacks. Most victims feel that they are being picked on by an attacker, right? And that's typically not the case. As Colby mentioned in the last sort of presentation, he's attacking every dating site simultaneously to find one girl that will like him unsuccessfully, right? And so this is not really this is a friend of mine, this is not a bespoke business, right? This is a factory, right? And that is really the only attacker's advantage, is to be creative. It's not a technical advantage. It's to recognize that if you want to steal 100 million credit cards, you don't need to go to American Express only. And you don't need to go to Visa, and you don't need to go to HSBC. You can go to the Dairy Queen, to Smucker's Jam, to all the hotel, the major and minor hotel chains, and you can find the same information. The proliferation of information around the world has made many more soft targets, right? And allows those easy wins and rushes that those guys were talking about. And that is the thing, that imagination is really the thing you want to try to take advantage of. And then the last thing is that they're using multi-vectors, right? Phishing is this phenomenon across all of the things that we want to protect within the enterprise. So the method to stopping it is really simple, right? It's to identify all of the things that make an attack, before an attack goes boom, that makes them obvious. Here's a simple example that people kind of fail to understand, and why there can be a friction when you're identifying hundreds of thousands of phishing sites every day. If I want to send any one of you an email with a link in it, right, and that link has a credential harvesting page, or a page that's going to inject code, or try to get you to download something, that page has to exist before the message can be sent, right? And so I think most people fail to recognize the sequencing of how these things are built. And what that means is that it's possible to identify that page before it could be sent. And that is a good example of how you can preempt it. You can actually find a page without knowing it's going to be sent to your users, but do something about it because it's a risk area. And if you do that early enough, then you can measure when does it actually happen and how much time advantage did I create on that front. So early campaign identification is key. The second is being proactive and identifying the infrastructure that's being used to deliver attacks. And then ultimately, the key thing is shut it all down, right? Take action, be preemptive on that front. And then lastly, for myself, it feels like in these conferences, there is a really negative tone, or there's a kind of a defeatism in the space. And one of the things I like about living in Silicon Valley is that everything seems possible all the time, except for cybersecurity, which is so strange. And so, we like to say that this is definitely a possible problem, right? Humans have accomplished so many amazing things. Today, you can put water into a thermos, and that thermos knows whether the water is hot or cold, right? And it stays that way. That's amazing, right? You can take that's a joke, right? Well, that's a grandfather joke, right? You can take someone's heart out of their chest, put a pig heart in, and they'll go home the next day, right? We all carry these phones around. We do all these amazing things, and to think that these two guys are people that we can't stop from stealing our information, that's unacceptable, and I think we can do better, and it starts by identifying the root cause. So I know people want drinks, but I'm happy to take questions or take questions over drinks, or, yeah.
So if the idea is you go after the infrastructure, how do you get enough people to work together to go after the infrastructure? Because one company, one person, one security company can't do it alone, right? You can't take out all the infrastructure. You can take the Russian infrastructure out, much less, all the hackers and all the criminal gangs.
Well, it turns out, I think, a couple things. One, we're all using the same infrastructure, which is the internet, right? And attackers, for all the talk of the dark web, don't have a special infrastructure that they can use. And because of the kind of move to the cloud over the last 10 years, it's more possible to compute the entire internet every day at a cheaper cost than it was ever before. And so I think that you can do that, and it's something that we do every day. But I think you can also look to other disciplines where people are displacing infrastructure all the time. Look at Uber, right? How can you displace all this infrastructure for taxis and for all these other things? How can you do all these amazing things? And companies are doing that, and they're finding ways to have success on that front. I'm supposed to repeat the questions. I failed already. So, others or softball, Ted?
How much phishing do you see on a daily basis, Oren?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have an exact number for you. We have some estimates that from our studies, which are that for every 5,000 messages that goes to an organization, one of them is a targeted phishing attack that will cause damage, right? It's not spam, it's something more to that. We see hundreds of thousands of new phishing websites created every day. A lot of that is reuse and moving of these sites, but massive, right, on that front. I think that volume in this space is the wrong metric. Because companies will often, or there are these numbers that come out of the Pentagon, which are we're attacked X number of times every minute, every second. But we all know that there's various degrees of scanning and things of that nature. What really matters are the attacks that cause the damage. And that's why I was saying that for the 98% of things that people catch as spam, a bigger number isn't better if the smaller number represents all of the damage. Pablo.
Yes, you show us the graphic of time, right? And you said that before you can send an email, you have to prepare the site and things like that.
Yeah.
If this is a factor, right, and they optimize that,
Yeah.
are you seeing people taking less than 180 days? They're getting faster, smarter?
No. To do this on that? No, I mean, I think really sophisticated organizations that engage in this for either criminal or national security purposes need to have a sense of stability, and that is often in the infrastructure to launch their attacks. It's not a simple thing to do that en masse and to move it around. These are teams, these are groups that are trying to conduct very large-scale things. And they have a lot of success doing it every day. Some of the most prolific nation state and criminal groups that we see phishing every day are phishing thousands of organizations. Those organizations are across multiple sectors, across multiple countries. Will include religious organizations, Fortune 500, small schools, banks. Understanding their motivation for that is very challenging, but it just is happening in such a way that requires some sort of platform behind the scenes to do it.
How far in advance can you find the attack before anyone else can see it?
Sure. Shah, what's the largest that we've seen? Over a year?
363 days.
Yeah. So part of that is when does the attack happen to you, right? And so what we see is a great amount of reuse in the types of genetic sequencing for the attacks that can be used for vaccinations. And so the same, and so we've seen this in the last week, the same attack that was used throughout the election has been used subsequently post the election against hundreds of Fortune 500 companies, including all of the 5 largest banks. And so we're able to say to them, you can actually take action on this and just measure when did it happen. It's only a matter of time, right? And so the time to think about when did the attack happen is not when it goes boom, as I said, but grading that opportunity. So I'm sorry, you had a question. Yeah.
No, I just had a comment. So as one of the world's largest banks, since we'll say that, we're thinking about the problem differently. And that is, we've already said that people are our weakest link. And they're stupid. And education doesn't work. So what we've done is we've turned email into an entitlement. And we only give the ability to receive email externally to people that have to. So when we talk about send and receive, if we're talking about send email, we've made these all entitlements, and we've told our managers, if your people don't need to receive emails, tell them they can't receive emails, and we turn them off to the internet. We don't make their domain, their email address accessible. Phishing done through email. They can't get one. You can't get an email. You can't phish this person. And we don't care who it is. Now, is this going to solve the problem? No. But is it going to reduce the attack surface? Absolutely. Switch that around and say, if you don't have to send external email, take that away. Now data leakage becomes a 0 through that vector. Now, as you said, there are other vectors that people can get at it, but it's a very simple way. And we've taken it away from over a third of our population where we said, you know what? It's not an entitlement. If you need to send email, we'll give you a guest network, use your iPhone. You've all got, wonderful devices. If that's what you need to do your personal business, do it. But if you're doing company business, take it away. And for us, that's problem solving. So there are some ways, I think, if you think about this creatively, there's certainly not one way to attack all, to deal with all those attack vectors. That wasn't too hard a decision, and there wasn't a big outcry, from people saying, because most email is, between you and all your compatriots, in the company. There are people who need to send it. We're going to continue to crack down on that. And regulators love that. So it's a very easy discussion and not a difficult people discussion. And technology-wise, not a hard thing to do technology-wise as well.
Yeah, I think certainly access to data, limiting those types of vectors are all good things. But one thing that we know is that employees, humans, are also very clever in figuring out ways to move their data to Dropbox and to do things. And particularly as attacks can go personal as well as to corporate systems, there is a lot of risk for blending there. And the problem just needs a technical one, I think, to solve it. So, agreed.
So to kind of spin off that a little bit, but to interact with the problem that we see, which is you had alluded earlier, you had stated earlier that these are basically spam mills, right? They're targeting hundreds of thousands of companies all over the world, over tens of thousands. We've seen consistently well-targeted and phishing attacks at our executive leaders that speak to each other as other executive leaders, either at the C-suite level.
Yeah.
Do you see groups that are organizing around organizational structure and then being very fine in their targeting?
Yeah, so I think what you're, it's a great question, right? So I think what you're confusing with the distinction that I'm making, right? I won't say that you're confusing. The distinction that I'm making is that to a user, right, it can appear that it's highly targeted because it's addressed to someone, or the subject line evokes some sort of emotion or theme that matters, or they've taken advantage of relationships within the organization. But what we find consistently is behind that, the mechanics of how these attacks are built and sent out is extremely vanilla, right? And there is nothing unique about it. There is no one guy that is creating the masterpiece, for you. It is teams of people, hundreds of people building these things. And that if you take a step one further back and you don't try to do lexicographic analysis of the words, you find the commonalities, what makes it more similar, right? In the flu, as I mentioned, we don't study every variant of it. We find the things that make it most common and we vaccinate around that. And the same applies in this space as well. But I would agree that it certainly appears that way to you, but as we dig further and further back, it often is not the case there. And attackers show us that through the amount of success that they're having. You just cannot succeed the way the groups are by being so carefully crafted, right? They are just not hand knitting all of these sweaters and then shipping them onto you like on Etsy for a premium in that way. So there was a question.
So how much new do you see? In the sense of so you're sort of thinking about this vaccination approach, and you're identifying the common traits of vaccine against those. When do you see sort of a new variant that you need to identify a new set of vaccines for? Is it really common? Is it really unusual? How unusual? How common?
Well, one of the most common things that we see recently is that what makes it new is what's new in our society, right? So there's been a real big proliferation of cloud-based storage attacks, the Google, the Dropbox, and that's because they have grown in popularity, and there's a trust factor in those brands. So, part of it is just what's happening in our world. A lot of what we see as new also follows the calendar. It's common to track tax season, to track Christmas holidays, to track global events like the election or the G20 summit or things that are happening all over the world. So new, I think, it can be often caught up in those. What's happening in our world, what's happening on the calendar, not as much new, underneath behind the scenes, and mostly because it's very easy, right? We're just having a lot of success in this space. There's not a great need to sort of innovate on that front. For me, it can often feel like Alice in Wonderland, right? For a CISO, you're like looking through this mirror, and on the other side of the mirror, or maybe it's Alice through the looking glass, you're having all these people talking like Jabberwockies and in gibberish, and there's a Red Queen that's doing the thing backwards, and you need to have this and that. And so attackers see that, right? And they just kind of work around that. They see the reflection that we put in front of them, and they just kind of do the opposite. And when all of the focus is on something other, they just continue to succeed with the things that are easy. I don't know who likes Lewis Carroll, but I did, growing up. So. Anything else? Others? Drinks? Cocktails? Okay, I'm buying. All right, thanks.